Hello class, this is Emergency Care and Transportation of the Sick and Injured, Chapter 39, Incident Management. After you complete this chapter and the coursework related to it, you'll be able to describe and apply in context the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, to include describing command of general staff roles, and additionally, you'll be able to describe various specialized components of establishing incident command and its inherent responsibilities. Also, you will learn the importance of using the Incident Command System, or ICS, in HazMat incidents and setting up EMS branch operations. We'll talk about control zones, personal protective equipment, and triage methods. Knowledge of operational roles and responsibilities to ensure patient, public, and personnel safety is extremely important. And with incident management, you'll learn how to establish and work within the incident management system. And then when you actually roll on a scene where it's in place, you'll be familiar with and comfortable with sliding right into the operation at hand. With multiple casualty incidents, there are things we're going to discuss. Triage principles, resource management, triage, performing at a multiple casualty incident, re-triaging patients and destination decisions, and we'll also talk about post-traumatic and cumulative stress as they relate to you. With hazardous materials, you need to learn the different categories of responder. And with hazardous materials awareness, this level teaches you to know the risks and responsibilities of operating in a cold zone at a hazardous material or some other special incident. The most challenging situation you can be called to are disasters and mass casualty incidents, or MCIs. A mass casualty incident refers to any call that involves 3 or more patients, or any situation that places such a great demand on available equipment or personnel that the system would require a mutual aid response. An agreement between neighboring EMS systems to respond when local resources are insufficient to handle the response. These incidents can be overwhelming because you will find a large number of patients and not enough resources. The use of the Incident Command System, or ICS, makes it possible to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. As an EMT, you will typically be assigned to work within the EMS/medical branch under an ICS. The National Incident Management System, or NIMS, was developed to promote efficient coordination of emergency incidents at the regional, state, and national levels. The Secretary of Homeland Security implemented the NIMS system in 2004. It provides a framework to enable federal, state, and local governments, as well as private sector and non-governmental organizations, to work together effectively. The organizational structure must be flexible enough to rapidly be adapted for use in any situation. And the NIMS provides a standardization in terminology, resource classification, personnel training, and certification. Another important feature is the concept of interoperability, which refers to the ability of agencies of different types or from different jurisdictions to communicate with each other. And again, that's interoperability, not inoperability. Interoperability. And again, that refers to the ability of agencies of different types or from different jurisdictions to be able to communicate with each other clearly and effectively. The ICS is one component of the NIMS. The major NIMS components are as follows. Preparedness, and in regards to that, the NIMS establishes measures for all responders to incorporate into their systems to prepare for their response to all incidents at any time. Communications and Informations Management. NIMS communications and information systems enable the essential functions needed to provide interoperability. And resource management. The NIMS sets up mechanisms to describe, inventory, track, and dispatch resources before, during, and after an incident. And then command and management. The NIMS standardizes incident management for all hazards and across all levels of government. It's based on three key constructs: ICS, Incident Command System, multi-agency coordination systems, and public information systems. Ongoing management and maintenance. The NIMS Integration Center, or NIC, provides strategic direction for and oversight of the NIMS, supporting routine maintenance and continuous improvement of the system in the long term. The Incident Command System, or ICS, is sometimes referred to as the Incident Management System. The purpose of ICS is to ensure responder and public safety, achieve incident management goals, and ensure the efficient use of resources. Communication is the building block of good patient care. Common terminology and the use of quote-unquote clear text communications helps responders from multiple agencies work efficiently together. The goal of the ICS is to make the best use of your resources to manage the environment around the incident and to treat patients during an emergency. The ICS is designed to control duplication of effort and freelancing. Freelancing is when individual units or different organizations make independent and often inefficient decisions about the next appropriate action. One of the organizing principles of ICS is limiting the span of control of any one individual. This refers to keeping the supervisor/worker ratio at one supervisor for 3 to 7 workers. Organizational levels may include sections, branches, divisions, and groups. Sections are responsible for a major functional area such as finance, logistics, planning, or operations. Branches tend to be established when span of control is a problem and are in charge of activity directly related to the section, i.e. fire, law enforcement, EMS, etc. Divisions usually refer to crews working in the same geographic area. The larger the incident, the more divisions there will be. Groups usually refer to crews working in the same functional area, but possibly in different locations. The figure on this slide illustrates the ICS organizational structure. This is something you absolutely need to know. So make sure you review it carefully and take it to heart and memory, because you will use it at some point in time. The ICS roles and responsibilities is what we're going to talk about now. The general staff includes command, finance, logistics, operations, and planning. Command staff includes the Public Information Officer, or PIO, Safety Officer, and the Liaison Officer. With command, the Incident Commander, or IC, is in charge of the overall incident. He's the only one in charge. He assesses the incident and establishes the strategic objectives and priorities. He develops a plan to manage the incident. Large incidents require multi-agency or multi-jurisdictional response and the need to use a unified command system. A single command system is one in which a person is in charge, even if multiple agencies respond. So make sure you remember that. This is a single command system and one person is in charge, even though you have agencies from Highway Patrol, local sheriffs, local EMS, firefighting, etc. Ideally, it is used for short duration, limited incidents that require the services of a single agency. That's ideally. It is important that EMTs know who the IC is, how to communicate with the IC, and where the command post is located. If the incident is very large, EMTs will report to a supervisor working under the IC. So remember that the IC is in charge, but if you are at a really huge incident, you will probably have a supervisor, but that supervisor still answers to the one and only person who's ultimately in charge, and that's the IC. So if you roll in a scene where there are multiple agencies and mass casualties, find out who's the incident who's the incident commander in charge, and if there are supervisors, and if so, which supervisor do you report to? Now, an IC may turn over command to someone with more experience in a critical area. This change or transfer of command must take place in an orderly manner and, if possible, face-to-face. When an incident draws to a close, there should be a termination of command. Your agency should have demobilization procedures to implement as the situation de-escalates or comes to an end. The finance section is responsible for documenting all expenditures at an incident for reimbursement, although this is not usually needed at smaller incidents. There are various functions within the finance section: time unit, procurement unit, compensation and claims unit, and cost unit. In terms of the logistics section, the logistics section or section chief has responsibility for communications equipment, facilities, food and water, fuel, lighting, and medical equipment and supplies for patients and emergency responders. The operations section works as follows. At a very large or complex incident, the operations section is responsible for managing the tactical operations usually handled by the IC. The operations section chief will supervise the people working at a scene of an incident who will be assigned to branches, divisions, and groups. The planning section solves problems as they arise. It obtains data about the problem, analyzes the previous incident plan, predicts what or who is needed to make the new plan work, and works closely with operations, finance, and logistics sections. Another function is to develop an incident action plan, which is the central tool for planning during a response to a disaster or emergency. Let me just repeat that last statement. Another function is to develop an incident action plan, which is the central tool for planning during a response to a disaster or emergency. The command staff. The safety officer monitors the scene for conditions or operations that may present a hazard to responders and patients. He or she has the authority to stop an emergency operation whenever a rescuer is in danger. This is the only person that can override the incident commander, but this is their direct responsibility. A safety officer should remove hazards to EMS personnel and patients before the hazards cause injury. The Public Information Officer, or PIO, provides the public and media with clear and understandable information. The designated PIO may cooperate with PIOs from other agencies in a joint information center. The liaison officer relays information and concerns along command, the general staff, and other agencies. Now let's talk about communications and information management. Communication has historically been the weak point at most major incidents. It is recommended that communications definitely be integrated. All agencies should be able to communicate quickly and effortlessly via radio. Communications allow for accountability throughout the incident, as well as an instant communication between recipients. Now let's talk about mobilization and deployment. When an incident has been declared and the need for additional resources has been identified, a request is made for additional resources. Check in at the incident. Upon arrival at an incident, you should check in with the incident commander, as I mentioned earlier. Checking in accomplishes different functions. It allows you to be assigned to a supervisor for job tasking, allows for personnel tracking throughout the incident, and ensures that cost pay and reimbursement can be calculated accurately. There will be an initial incident briefing When you report to your supervisor for an initial briefing, this will allow you to get information regarding the incident as well as specific job functions and responsibilities. Incident record keeping. If a large piece of equipment becomes inoperable, it may be possible for replacement costs to come from the incident. Record keeping allows for tracking of time spent on the actual incident for reimbursement purposes. Now we're going to discuss accountability. Accountability means keeping your supervisor advised of your location, actions, and completed tasks. It includes advising your supervisor of the tasks that you've been unable to complete and what tools you need to complete them. Then there is incident demobilization. Once the incident has been stabilized and all the hazards mitigated, the IC will determine what resources are needed or not needed and when to begin demobilization. This process allows for a prompt return of resources to their parent organizations so that they can be placed back in service. Now we're going to talk now about EMS response within the incident command system. First and foremost, there is preparedness. Preparedness involves the decisions made and the basic planning done before an incident occurs. Preparedness in a given area involves decisions and planning about the most likely natural disasters for the area, among other disasters. Your EMS agency should have written disaster plans that you are regularly trained to carry out. A copy of the disaster plan should be kept in each EMS vehicle. Your local EMS organizations should develop an assistance program for the families of EMS responders. Now let's talk about scene size up. Sizing up a scene starts with dispatch. When you arrive first on the scene, you will make an initial assessment and some preliminary decisions. The size up will be driven by three basic questions. What do I have? In other words, you need to assess the scene for hazards. Then confirm the incident location and establish whether the incident is open or closed. An open incident is not yet contained and is producing more patients. A closed incident is contained and all casualties are accounted for. Estimate the number of casualties and report immediately to dispatch when you've sized up a scene. And then ask yourself, what do I need? Decide what resources are needed. You may need more EMS responders, ambulances, or other forms of transportation. Then what do I need to do? Consider the safety of yourself, your partner, other rescuers, the patient, and any bystanders. In that order. You and your partner and other rescuers, safety comes first. Otherwise, you become another casualty. And you might be at a scene that's under-resourced already. So you have to think about it in that perspective. You may have to initially work to isolate or stabilize the incident before providing care to injured persons, as I just said. Remember, you cannot help the injured if the scene is unstable. The figure on this slide shows a mobile emergency room. Now, establishing command. Command should be established by the most senior official. Notification to other responders should go out and necessary resources should be requested. A command system ensures that resources are effectively and efficiently coordinated. Command must be established early, preferably by the first arriving, most experienced public safety official. Communications. If possible and whenever possible, use face-to-face communications to limit radio traffic. If you communicate via radio, do not use 10 codes or signals. Most communication problems should be worked out before a disaster happens by designating channels strictly for command during a disaster. Communications equipment must be reliable, durable, and field tested. And be sure there are backups in place. Your plan should include a plan B in case of communications failure. Now let's talk about the medical branch of incident command. A medical incident command is more commonly known as the medical or EMS branch of the ICS. The medical branch director will supervise the primary roles of the medical branch: triage, treatment, and transport of injured people. The medical branch director will help ensure that EMS units responding to the scene are working within the ICS, and each medical division or group receives a clear assignment before beginning to work at the scene. Personnel remain with their vehicle in the staging area until they are assigned to their duties. The figure on this slide illustrates the components of the medical branch. And just like the other slide, this slide you also need to read and memorize and know, so that there are no surprises when you come to a scene that involves mass casualty or disaster. Now, the triage supervisor is ultimately in charge of counting and prioritizing patients. The primary duty of the triage division or group is to ensure that every patient receives initial assessment of his or her condition. One of the most difficult parts of being a triage supervisor is that you must not begin treatment until all patients are triaged, or you will compromise your triage efforts. Now, the treatment supervisor will locate and set up the treatment area with a tier for each priority of patient. Treatment supervisors ensure that the secondary triage of patients is performed and that adequate patient care is given as resources allow. Treatment supervisors also assist with moving patients to the transportation area. The transportation supervisor coordinates the transportation and distribution of patients to appropriate receiving hospitals and helps to ensure that hospitals do not become overwhelmed by a patient surge. The transportation supervisor documents and tracks the number of transport vehicles, patients transported, and the facility destination of each vehicle and patient. The staging supervisor is assigned when an MCI or disaster requires a multi-vehicle or multi-agency response. Emergency vehicles must have permission from the staging supervisor to enter an MCI scene and should only drive in the directed area. The staging area should be established away from the scene so that parked vehicles are not in the way. Physicians on scene, if they are there, will have the ability to make difficult triage decisions. They also provide secondary triage decisions in the treatment area, deciding which priority patients are to be transported first. Physicians can provide on-scene medical direction for EMTs, and they can provide care in the treatment sector as appropriate. The rehabilitation supervisor establishes an area that provides for the protection of responders from elements and the situation at large. The rehabilitation area should be located away from exhaust fumes and crowds and out of the view of the scene itself. Rehabilitation is where responders' needs for rest, fluids, food, and protection from the elements are met. The rehabilitation supervisor must also monitor responders for signs of stress, including fatigue, altered thinking patterns, complete collapse. Extrication and special rescue. There is an extrication supervisor or rescue supervisor that determines the type of equipment and resources needed for a specific situation. Because extrication and rescue are medically complex, the supervisors will usually function under the EMS branch of the ICS. Then there's a morgue supervisor, and the morgue supervisor will work with area medical examiners, coroners, disaster mortuary assistance teams, and law enforcement agencies to coordinate removal of bodies and body parts. The morgue supervisor should attempt to leave the dead victims in the location found if possible until a removal and storage plan can be determined. The morgue area should be out of the view of living patients and other responders, and it should be secured from the public. Now, with MCIs or mass casualty incident, remember an MCI is an emergency situation that involves 3 or more patients, and it places great demand on the EMS system and or has the potential to produce multiple casualties. All systems have different protocols for when to declare an MCI and initiate the ICS. As the EMT, ask yourself the following questions when considering whether the call is an MCI. How many seriously injured or ill patients can you care for effectively and transport in your ambulance? What happens when you have 3 patients to deal with? How long will it take for additional help to arrive? What happens if the number of patients exceeds the number of available ambulances? You and your team cannot treat and transport all injured patients at the same time. At an MCI, you will often experience an increased demand for equipment and personnel. You should never leave the scene with patients if there are still other patients present who are sick or wounded. This will leave patients at the scene without medical care and can be considered abandonment. If there are multiple patients and not enough resources to handle them without abandoning victims, you should declare an MCI, request additional resources, and initiate the ICS and triage procedures. Triage simply means to sort out, quote unquote, patients based on the severity of their injuries. The goal of doing the greatest good for the greatest number means that the triage assessment is brief and the patient condition categories are basic. Primary triage is the initial triage done in the field. Secondary triage is done as patients are brought to the treatment area. During primary triage, patients are briefly assessed and then identified in some way, such as by attaching a triage tag or triage tape. After the primary triage, the triage supervisor should communicate the following information to the medical branch director: the total number of patients, the number of patients in each of the triage categories, and recommendations for extrication and movement of patients to the treatment area, and resources needed to complete triage and begin movement of patients. When the initial triage has been completed, secondary triage or re-triage can occur, allowing for the EMT to reassess all remaining patients and to upgrade the triage category if necessary. The triage categories are as follows. There are 4 common triage categories. A is immediate, tagged red. These are first priority patients. They need immediate care and transport, and usually have problems with ABCs, head trauma, or signs and symptoms of shock. The next is delayed or yellow tag. These are second priority patients. They need treatment and transport, but it can be delayed. They usually have multiple injuries to bones or joints, including back injuries with or without spinal cord injury. The next one is minor or minimal, which is green tag. These are third priority patients. They may require no field or only minimal treatment. If they have any apparent injuries, they are usually soft tissue injuries such as contusions, abrasions, and lacerations. And then the last category is expectant and black tag. These are victims who are likely to die or who have possibly already died. These are, of course, last priority patients. These are patients who are dead or whose injuries are so severe they have at best a minimal chance of survival. It may include patients who are in cardiac arrest or who have an open head injury. Patients in this category receive treatment and transport only after patients in the other 3 categories have received care. The table on this slide defines the 4 common triage categories that I just went over. This is table 39-1 in your book. And just like the other slides that had tables, then I thought you should memorize and know. You absolutely should know this one as well. That way, when you're at a scene, you see the color tags or tape right away, or you're able to categorize patients using those tags or tape. So definitely know this table inside out, just like the others. Now, triage tags, tagging patients early assists in tracking them and helps keep an accurate record of their condition. Triage tags should be weatherproof and easily read. The patient tags or tape should be color-coded and should clearly show the category of the patient. The tags will become part of the patient's medical record. Whatever label system is used, it is imperative for the transportation officer to be able to identify which patient was transported by which unit and to which destination, and the priority of the patient's condition. Start triage we're going to talk about now. One of the easiest methods of triage is START. It stands for Simple Triage and Rapid Treatment. START. It uses a limited assessment of the patient's ability to walk, respiratory status, hemodynamic status, which is pulse, and neurologic status. The first step is performed on arrival at the scene by calling out to patients at the disaster site and then directing them to an easily identifiable landmark. The injured persons in this group are considered the walking wounded and are considered to be green or minimal priority or third priority patients. The second step is directed towards non-walking patients. You move to the first non-ambulatory patient and assess the respiratory status. If the patient is not breathing, open the airway using a simple maneuver. A patient who still does not begin to breathe is triaged as expectant or black. If the patient begins to breathe, tag him or her as immediate, which is red. Place the patient in the recovery position and move on to the next patient. If the patient is breathing, make a quick estimation of the respiratory rate. The next step is to assess the hemodynamic status of the patient by checking for bilateral radial pulses. The final assessment is to assess the patient's neurologic status by assessing the patient's ability to follow simple commands. Jumpstart triage is for pediatric patients. It's intended for use in children younger than 8 years of age or who appear to weigh less than 100 pounds. It begins by identifying the walking wounded, and infants or children not developed enough to walk or follow commands, including children with special needs, should be taken as soon as possible to the treatment sector for immediate secondary triage. There are several differences within the respiratory status assessment compared with that in START. If you find that a pediatric patient is not breathing, immediately check on the pulse. If there is no pulse, label the patient as expectant or black tag. If the patient is not breathing but has a pulse, open the airway with a manual maneuver. If the patient does not begin to breathe, give 5 rescue breaths and check respirations again. A child who does not begin to breathe should be labeled expectant or black tagged. The most common cause of cardiac arrest in children is respiratory arrest. The next step is to assess the approximate rate of respirations. And then following that, you need to check the hemodynamic status of the patient. Assess the pulse that you feel is the most competent and comfortable. If there is an absence of distal pulse, label the child as an immediate priority and move to the next patient. So if they have bilateral pulses in their neck or wrists, it depends on the size of the child, and that's what was just meant when they said to check for pulse in an area where you feel most comfortable and most competent. And so if you check their radial pulses or their pedal pulse, then as I just mentioned, if it's not present, label them as immediate priority and move to the next patient. So you may have a pulse in the neck but not have distal pulses, so they're immediate or red tag. The final assessment is for neurologic status. A modified AVPU score is used for START triage. Patients who are hysterical and disruptive to rescue efforts may need to be handled as an immediate priority and transported off the site, even if they're not seriously injured. A responder who becomes sick or injured during the rescue effort should be handled as an immediate priority and transported off the site as soon as possible. Hazardous material or HazMat and weapons of mass destruction incidents force the HazMat team to identify patients as contaminated or decontaminated before the regular triage process. Then there are destination decisions. All patients triaged as immediate red tag or delayed yellow tag should preferably be transported by ground ambulance or air ambulance if available. In extremely large situations, a bus may transport the walking wounded. Immediate priority patients should be transported 2 at a time until all are transported from the site. Then patients in the delayed category can then be transported 2 or 3 at a time until all are in hospital. Finally, the walking wounded are transported. Expectant patients who are still alive, in other words, they were categorized black or black tagged. So these are expectant patients who are black tagged and still alive would receive treatment and transport at this time. Dead victims are handled or transported according to the standard operating procedure for the area. Early notification to receiving facilities will allow for the hospitals to increase staffing and move patients within their facility as required. Now we're going to talk about disaster management. A disaster is a widespread event that disrupts functions and resources of a community and threatens lives and property. Many disasters may not involve personal injuries, but on the other hand, many disasters such as floods, fires, and hurricanes will result in widespread injuries. Unlike an MCI, which generally lasts no more than a few hours, emergency responders will generally be on the scene of a disaster for days, 2 weeks, and sometimes months. Only an elected official can declare a disaster. Your role in a disaster is to respond when requested and report to the IC for assigned tasks. In a disaster with an overwhelming number of casualties, area hospitals may decide they cannot treat all patients in their facility or facilities. They may mobilize medical and nursing teams with equipment, and if the situation requires using a facility, such as a warehouse near the disaster scene, the nursing teams will set up a casualty collection area to perform triage, provide medical care, and transport patients to the hospital on a priority basis. If a casualty collection area is established, it will be coordinated through the ICS in the same way as all other branches and areas of the operation. Now we're going to do an introduction to hazardous materials, or HazMat. When you arrive at a possible HazMat incident, you must first step back and assess the situation. Rushing into unsafe scenes can have catastrophic results. If overcome, you will be unable to assist patients, requiring emergency care yourself, and then you will further strain the EMS system. Because of the unique aspects of responding to and working at a HazMat incident, OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has published a set of guidelines known as Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response Standard, also abbreviated and referred to as HazWOPER, HazWOPER. EMTs are required to have training at the first responder awareness level, which you heard me mention at the beginning of this lecture. First responders at the awareness level should have sufficient training or experience to demonstrate the following competencies: an understanding of what hazardous substances are and the risks associated with them, and an understanding of the potential outcomes of the incident. They'll also be required to have the ability to recognize the presence of hazardous substances and the ability to identify the hazardous substances if possible, an understanding of the role of first responder awareness individual in the emergency response plan, and the ability to determine the need for additional resources and notify the communication center. Now we're going to talk about recognizing a hazardous material. A hazardous material is any material that poses an unreasonable risk of damage or injury to persons, property, or the environment if it is not properly controlled during handling, storage, manufacture, processing, and packing, use and disposal, and transportation. Train yourself to take the time to look at the whole scene so you can identify the critical visual indicators and fit them into what is known about the problem. Hazardous materials may be involved in any of the following situations: a truck or train crash in which a substance is leaking from a tank truck or a railroad tank car, a leak, fire, or other type of emergency at an industrial plant, refinery, or complex where chemicals or explosives are produced, used, or stored, a leak or rupture of an underground natural gas pipe. There could also be a situation where you have deterioration of underground fuel tanks and seepage of oil or gasoline into the surrounding ground. And there could be also a buildup of methane or other byproducts of waste decomposition in sewers or sewage processing plants. There could be a motor vehicle crash that results in a ruptured gas tank, and sometimes the radiator will also be broken and leaking out coolant. It is important to approach the scene from a safe location and direction. Remember, you want to be uphill and upwind. The traditional rules of staying uphill and upwind are the best place to start. It may be wise to use binoculars and view the scene from a safe distance, and be sure to question anyone involved in the incident. The figures on this slide show two examples of a hazardous material incident. The one on the left, you see a pipeline of gas that has erupted and caught on fire. And on the right, you see a motor vehicle crash where a small bus has hit a tanker it's now leaking off vapors. Now we're going to discuss occupancy and location. A wide variety of chemicals are stored in warehouses, hospitals, laboratories, industrial complexes, residential garages, bowling alleys, and home improvement centers, gardening supply stores, and restaurants. The location and type of building are two good indicators of the possible presence of a hazardous material. Now let's talk about senses in relation to a HazMat incident. The senses can be safely used are those of sight and sound. Using any of your other senses that bring you in proximity to the chemical should be done with caution, or more importantly, probably avoided altogether, just because you don't have the specialized training and equipment needed. Clues that are seen or heard from a distance may enable you to take precautionary steps. Now we'll discuss containers. In basic terms, a container is any vessel or receptacle that holds a material. Often the container type, size, and material of construction provides important clues about the nature of the substance inside. Do not rely solely on the type of container, however, when making a determination about hazardous materials. One way to distinguish containers is to divide them into two categories based on their capacity: bulk and non-bulk storage containers. You also want to consider container volume. Bulk storage containers include fixed tanks, highway cargo tanks, rail tank cars, totes, intermodal tanks. In general, bulk storage containers are found in buildings that rely on and need to store large quantities of a particular chemical. Often these bulk storage containers are surrounded by a secondary containment system to help control an accidental release. Large volume horizontal tanks are also common. These tanks can hold a few hundred gallons to several million gallons of product and are usually made of aluminum, steel, or plastic. Totes have capacities ranging from 119 gallons to 703 gallons. They can contain any type of chemical, including flammable liquids, corrosives, food-grade liquids, or oxidizers. Shipping and storage totes can be hazardous because they have no secondary containment system. Here's an example of totes containers. And you can see it's just the container and the material inside. Whereas at a large facility, you'll have a storage area, and depending on what is being stored, there'll be some type of containment dome or building around it. Intermodal tanks are both shipping and storage vessels. They hold between 5,000 and 6,000 gallons of product and can be pressurized or non-pressurized. The figure on this slide shows an intermodal tank. Now we'll talk about non-bulk storage vessels. This is all types of containers other than bulk containers. They hold commonly used commercial and industrial chemicals such as solvents, industrial cleaners, and compounds, and are frequently the drums or barrels that you see or have seen commonly throughout your life. They're easily recognizable barrel-like containers. These are drums, and are used to store a wide variety of substances, including food-grade materials, corrosives, flammable liquids, and grease. Generally, the nature of the chemical dictates the construction of the storage drum. Then there are bags. These are commonly used to store solids and powders such as cement powder, sand, pesticides, soda ash, and slaked lime. It can also hold fertilizers. And these may be constructed of plastic, paper, or plastic-lined paper. Pesticide bags must be labeled with the specific information that follows: the name of the product, active ingredients, a hazard statement, the total amount of product in the container, the manufacturer's name and address, the EPA registration number, the EPA establishment number, and signal words to indicate the relative toxicity of the material, practical first aid treatment description, directions for use, agricultural use requirements, precautionary statements, storage and disposal information, and a classification statement on who may use the product. And it must also have a keep out of reach, quote unquote, statement. Keep out of the reach of children. Carboys transport and store corrosives and other types of chemicals. They are a glass, plastic, or steel container that holds 5 to 15 gallons of a product. Glass carboys are often placed in protective wood, foam, fiberglass, or steel box to help prevent breakage. This is an example of a carboy. Then you have cylinders. These are uninsulated compressed gas cylinders that are used to store substances such as nitrogen, argon, helium, and oxygen. So they're going to look like the oxygen bottles in your ambulance. The Department of Transportation, DOT, marking system is what we're going to talk about now. This consists of labels, placards, and other markings that are used on buildings, packages, boxes, and containers. The marking systems indicate the presence of a hazardous material from a safe distance and provide clues about the substance. The figure on this slide shows examples of labels, placards, and markings, and no doubt you've seen these on truck trailers and rail cars. Placards are diamond-shaped indicators. These are placed on 4 sides of highway transport vehicles, railroad tank cars, and other forms of transportation carrying hazardous materials. Labels are smaller versions of placards placed on the 4 sides of individual boxes and smaller packages being transported. The figure on this slide displays examples of placards. Then there are other considerations. The DOT system does not require that all chemical shipments be marked with placards or labels. In most cases, the package or cargo tank must contain a certain minimum amount of hazardous material before a placard is required. With commercial package delivery services, they often carry a small amount of hazardous materials that fall below the weight limit. The vehicle exterior will not display placards to warn off the danger. Conversely, some chemicals are so hazardous that shipping any amount of them requires the use of labels or placards anyway, such as explosives, poison gases, water-reactive solids, high-level radioactive substances. Now let's talk about reference material. This is a picture of the Emergency Response Guidebook. This offers a certain amount of guidance for responders operating at a hazmat incident. It's updated every 3 to 4 years. It provides information on approximately 4,000 chemicals. You may also encounter material safety data sheets. And material safety data sheets, or MSDS, are a common source of information about a particular chemical. They provide basic information about the chemical makeup of a substance, the potential hazards it presents, appropriate first aid in the event of an exposure, and other pertinent data for safe handling of the material. An MSDS, or Material Safety Data Sheet, will typically include the following details: the name of the chemical, including any synonyms for it, physical and chemical characteristics of the material, physical hazards of the material, and health hazards of the material, as well as signs and symptoms of exposure, routes of entry, permissible exposure limits, responsible party contact information, precautions for safe handling, and applicable control measures such as PPE, and emergency and first aid procedures, along with appropriate waste disposal. All facilities that use or store chemicals are required by law to have a Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, on file for each chemical used or stored in the facility. Then there are shipping papers. These are required whenever materials are transported from one place to another. They include the names and addresses of the shipper and the receiver, identify the material being shipped, and specify the quantity and weight of each part of the shipment. Shipping papers for road and highway transportation are called bills of lading or freight bills and are located in the cab of the vehicle. And they're supposed to be in the driver's side door pocket. The Chemical Transportation Emergency Center, it's also called ChemTrec, is operated by the American Chemistry Council. It provides invaluable technical information for first responders of all disciplines who are called upon to respond to chemical incidents. When you call ChemTrec, be sure to have the following basic information ready: the name of the chemical or chemicals involved in the incident, name of the caller and callback telephone number, location of the actual incident or problem, the shipper or manufacturer of the chemical if it's known, the container type, rail car or vehicle markings or numbers, the shipping carrier's name and recipient of material, and local conditions and exact description of the situation at hand. Now we'll talk about identification. Despite the availability of resources, identification may still be difficult. Little consistency is used on labels and placards, and dishonest transporters sometimes will not label containers or vessels appropriately. Always maintain a high index of suspicion when approaching the scene of a truck or train tanker accident. In the event of a leak or spill, a hazmat incident is often indicated by the presence of the following: visible cloud or strange-looking smoke from the escaping substance, leak or spill from a tank, container, truck, or railroad car with or without hazmat placards or labels, an unusual, strong, or noxious or harsh odor in the area. A large number of hazardous gases and fluids are essentially odorless even when a substantial leak or spill has occurred. If you approach a scene where more than one person has collapsed or is unconscious or in respiratory distress, you need to assume that there's been a hazmat leak or spill and it's unsafe to enter the area. The safety of you and your team, the other responders, and the public must be your most important concern. If, as you approach, any signs suggest that a hazmat incident has occurred, you should stop at a safe distance and park upwind or uphill from the incident. After rapidly sizing up the scene, call for the hazmat team. If you do not recognize the danger until you're too close, immediately leave the danger zone. Try to rapidly assess the situation and provide as much information as possible when calling for the hazmat team. Do not re-enter the scene and do not leave the area until you've been cleared by the hazmat team. because you may not have any symptoms, but you may be contaminated with something. So they have to clear you. Do not allow civilians to enter the scene if possible, and avoid all contact with the material. Now we'll talk about hazmat scene operations. Focus your efforts on activities that will ensure the safety and survival of the greatest number of people. Use the ambulance's public address system or PA system to alert individuals near the scene and direct them to move to a safer area. Then establishing control zones. Control zones are established at a hazmat incident based on the chemical and physical properties of the released material, environmental factors at the time of release, general layout of the scene, and securing access to the incident will also help ensure that no one will be accidentally inside a contaminated area. If the incident takes place inside a structure, the best place to control access is at the normal points of ingress and egress, which is doors, and possibly windows, but usually it's doors. If the incident occurs outside, control intersections on and off ramps, service roads, and other access routes to the scene. Control zones may be expanded or contracted, and this is something you need to be prepared for. It can be impacted by weather, cloud cover, time of day, ambient temperature, etc. The hot zone is the area immediately surrounding the release, which is also the most contaminated area. The physical characteristics of the released substance will significantly affect the size and layout of the hot zone. All specially trained responders entering the hot zone should avoid contact with the product to the greatest extent possible. All personnel and equipment must be decontaminated when they leave the hot zone. The warm zone is where personnel and equipment transition into and out of the hot zone. It contains control points for access to the hot zone as well as the decontamination area. Decontamination is the process of removing or neutralizing and properly disposing of hazardous materials from the equipment, patients, and rescue personnel. The cold zone is the safe area where personnel do not need to wear any special protective clothing for safe operation, and it includes personnel staging, the command post, EMS providers, the area for medical monitoring, support, and/or treatment after decontamination. The role of the EMT. Your job is to report to a designated area outside of the hot and warm zones and provide triage, treatment, transport, and rehabilitation. Now let's talk about classifications of hazardous materials. The National Fire Protection Association, NFPA 704, Hazardous Materials Classification Standard, classifies hazardous materials according to the health hazard or toxicity level, fire hazard, chemical reactive hazard, and special hazards. Let's talk about toxicity levels. Toxicity levels measures the health risk that a substance poses to someone who comes into contact with it. The higher the number, the greater the toxicity, as follows. Level 0 includes materials that would cause little, if any, health hazard if you came into contact with them. Level 1 includes materials that would cause irritation on contact, but only mild residual injury even without treatment. Level 2 indicates materials that could cause temporary damage or residual injury unless prompt medical treatment is provided. Level 3 includes materials that are extremely hazardous to health, and Level 4 includes materials that are so hazardous that minimal contact will cause death. All health hazards, with the exception of 0, require specialized training and respiratory and chemical protective gear that is not standard on most ambulances. This is table 39-2, and this is what we just went over, which is the toxicity levels of hazardous materials. 0 is little to no hazard, no protection needed, all the way up to 4, which is minimal exposure that can cause death, and it needs a special hazmat gear, level A suit. So you need to be aware of these, and remember, the higher the number, the greater the hazard. Now let's talk about personal protective equipment level. Personal protective equipment levels indicate the amount and type of protective gear that you need to prevent injury from particular substances. Level A is the most hazardous and requires fully encapsulated, chemical-resistant protective clothing that provides full body protection as well as SCBA and special sealed equipment. Level B requires non-encapsulated protective clothing or clothing that is designed to protect against a particular hazard. It also requires eye protection and breathing devices that contain their own air supply, such as SCBA. Level C, like Level B, requires the use of non-permeable clothing and eye protection. In addition, face masks that filter all inhaled outside air must be used. And Level D requires a work uniform such as coveralls that afford minimal protection. All levels of protection require the use of gloves. 2 pairs of rubber gloves are needed for protection in case one pair must be removed because of heavy contamination. The figures on this slide show the 4 levels of protection that I just went over. Level A protection is on the left. You see he's got on a specialized suit. Underneath that, you can barely make it out. He has a helmet and SCBA unit or self-contained breathing apparatus, special foot gear, and double glove, special type of gloves. All the way down to level D, which is coveralls and face masks so you're breathing filtered air, and hat, hard hat usually. Let's talk about caring for patients at a hazmat incident. It is practical only to provide the simplest assessment and essential care in the hazard zone and the decontamination area because of the dangers, time constraints, and bulky protective gear that team members wear. To avoid entrapment and spread of contaminants, no bandages or splints are applied except pressure dressings that are needed to control bleeding. The EMTs providing care in the treatment area should assess and treat patients in the same way as you would a patient who has not been previously assessed or treated. Your care of patients at a hazmat incident must address the following 2 issues: any trauma that has resulted from other related mechanisms, such as vehicle collision, fire, or explosion, and then also the injury and harm that have resulted from exposure to the toxic hazardous substance. Most serious injuries and deaths from hazardous materials result from airway and breathing problems. Maintain the airway and, if the patient appears to be in distress, give oxygen at 12 to 15 liters per minute in a non-rebreathing mask. Monitor the patient's breathing at all times. If there are signs that indicate respiratory distress and it's increasing, you may need to provide assisted ventilation with a bag valve mask, a BVM, and high flow oxygen. Treat the patient's injuries in the same way that you would treat any injury. Your treatment for the patient's exposure to the toxic substances should focus mainly on supportive care and initiating treatment to the hospital with a minimum of additional delay. Now let's talk about special care. In some cases, before the decontamination area has been completely set up, the hazmat team will find 1 or 2 patients who need immediate treatment and transport without further delay if they are to survive. In some cases, before the decontamination area has been completely set up, as I just mentioned, the hazmat team will find 1 or 2 patients who need immediate transport and treatment without further delay. So it may be necessary to simply cut away all the patient's clothing and do a rapid rinse if water is allowed. Some chemicals are water reactive. And if they're allowed to be decontaminated with water, you might want to do a rapid rinse to remove the majority of the contaminating matter before transport. You need to increase the amount of protective clothing that you wear, including SCBA, because of fumes that could come off, 2 pairs of gloves, goggles or a face shield, a protective coat, respiratory protection, a disposable fluid impervious apron or similar outfit. To make decontaminating the ambulance easier, make sure to tape the cabinet doors shut. Any equipment, kits, monitors, and other items that will not be used en route should be removed from the patient compartment and should be placed in front of the ambulance or in outside compartments. Before loading the patient, turn on the power vent ceiling fan and patient compartment air conditioning unit fan. When you leave the scene, inform the hospital that you are transporting a critically injured patient who has not been fully contaminated at the scene. Okay, class, we're going to get ready to review. I did want to tell you that we went through a lot of information that you need to know regarding hazardous materials. And we talked about the hazardous materials awareness level of training. That is not what you received here. The hazardous materials awareness level training is a separate class, and it goes into much more detail where you have actual examples of material safety data sheets. You learn how to use the emergency response guide, when to call Chemtrec, for example, etc. So we covered a lot of important information about hazardous materials, but you do need to complete a hazardous materials awareness level class, and you get a certification for that, and I recommend you do that as soon as possible. That way you have a much broader and in-depth knowledge of dealing with hazardous materials. But we covered a lot of the highlights and very important grounds. So now let's go over the review for the entire chapter. Question 1. What is the purpose of the ICS, or Incident Command System? A. Ensuring responder and public safety. B. Achieving incident management goals. C. Ensuring the efficient use of resources. Or D. All of the above. Let's check the answer. It is D. All of the above. The purpose of the ICS is to ensure responder and public safety, achieve incident management goals, and ensure the efficient use of resources. Since we went over the correct answer and it included A, B, and C, all of them as the correct answer, I'm not going to review them again here. Question 2. Upon arriving at a scene in which the incident command system has been activated, you should expect to A. Be passed from sector to sector as needed in between assignments. B. Report directly to the incident commander in between assignments. C. Be assigned to a specific responsibility for the duration of the incident. Or D. Be given general directions and allowed to function independently. If you read this one carefully and remember what we talked about, this should be very easy for you to get correct. And it is A. The incident commander establishes the different sectors of responsibility and officers for each of those sectors. When functioning at an incident in which the incident command system has been activated, you should report to the appropriate sector officer or supervisor, as we called them earlier, carry out your assignment, and report back to that sector officer. In many cases, you'll be asked to report to a different sector, so make sure that you know who to report to when, and if you are asked to report to a different officer, make sure you know exactly who that is and exactly where you're going. Let's look at the incorrect answers. And just to refresh ourselves, upon arriving in a scene in which an incident command system has been activated, you should expect to A. Be passed from sector to sector as needed in between assignments. That's the correct answer. B. Report directly to the incident commander in between assignments. Remember, he's divided everything up into sectors or sections, so only sector or unit officers report back to the IC. So you respond to your supervisor or sector or unit officer, depending on how it's called there at the scene, and they report to the incident commander. C, be assigned to a specific responsibility for the duration of the incident. As the scene dynamics change, responsibilities may change. As sector officers see these needs change, they are probably going to impact your responsibilities. D, be given general directions and allowed to function independently. Well, we know, of course, that's wrong, because the purpose behind ICS is to prevent personnel from freelancing. If you're just randomly wandering among a scene, there's a good chance that you're going to get run over or injured, be in the way, and you need to be in control, have somebody controlling your set of responsibilities that are assigned to you, so that accidents don't happen and everybody is doing their job and mitigating the scene effectively. 3. When EMS responds to a disaster as part of their response within the ICS, EMS would start with a scene size up. What is the next step for the first responding units? So you've started with a scene size up. You know, that's rule number 1, always. Even at an MCI, mass casualty incident, or disaster, that's the first thing you do. So what is the next step? A, communicating with additional units. B, establishing command. C, caring for any injuries. Or D, stabilizing the incident. This should be pretty easy. And it is B. The first EMS unit to arrive needs to function within the ICS. Once you have performed a good scene size up and answered the 3 basic questions to complete a scene size up, and we went over those earlier, command should be established by the most senior official, notification to other responders should go out, and necessary resources should be requested. Let's look at the incorrect answers. When EMS responds to a disaster as part of their response within the ICS, EMS would start with a scene size up. What is the next step for the first responding units? A, communicating with additional units. Communications occur after command has been established. B, establishing command. Of course, that's the correct answer. C, caring for any injuries. Again, triage occurs after communication's been established or stabilizing the incident. Demobilization procedures occur at the end of the response. So stabilizing the incident and then demobilizing the incident is the last part. So make sure all those steps we went through earlier, you need to make sure that you know those in proper order. Number 4, which of the following statements best describes a mass casualty incident? A, at least half the patients are dead. B, either a bus or an airplane has crashed. C, you have more than 2 critical patients. Or D, the patient count exhausts your resources. If you think back to the definition of a mass casualty incident, this answer will be easy. D, a mass casualty situation is one that places such a great demand on available resources or personnel that the system is stretched to its limits or beyond. While bus accidents and plane crashes are classic examples of MCIs, they are not the only type of situation where you can have your resources exhausted. Now let's look at the incorrect answers. Which of the following statements best describes a mass casualty incident? A, at least half the patients are dead. That's incorrect because MCIs are not based on the number of fatalities. Thank heavens. B, either a bus or an airplane has crashed. It's an example of an MCI, but ironically, there may be very few patients. It depends on what exactly happened, and every plane crash, every bus crash, every single crash is different. Just like every medical call you go on, it's going to be different. C, you have more than 2 critical patients. Well, this situation places a burden upon the first EMS providers, but it may not stress available resources overall. D, the patient count exhausts your resources. That's the correct answer. So if you roll up on a scene and you have 2 critical patients, that's not going to exhaust your resources on scene. You're trained to do that. But if you have 3, 4, or 5, that's going to exhaust your resources on scene. You can't possibly treat and transport all of these patients. So your resources are exhausted right there. And that is when you know you've got a mass casualty incident. The second you reach a point where you can't handle it as a team or unit, then you need help. That's a mass casualty incident. Number 5, which of the following patients would have the highest treatment priority at the scene of a mass casualty incident? A, 24-year-old man who's unconscious, has snoring respirations and severe burns. B, a 32-year-old woman who is pulseless and apneic with an abdominal evisceration. C, a 29-year-old woman who is in full cardiac arrest with massive open chest trauma. D, 32-year-old man with an open head injury, exposed brain matter, and no carotid pulse. So remember, this is a mass casualty incident. So which of these has the highest priority? Think about how they're categorized and tagged. And the correct answer is A. 3 of the 4 patients, B, C, and D, are dead. If you go back and read those, which we'll go over in a minute, you'll see they're all dead. So triage efforts at that point are aimed at providing the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. So in this case, attempting to resuscitate a patient in traumatic cardiac arrest is futile in almost all cases. So again, the answer is A. So let's review these. Which of the following patients would have the highest treatment priority at the scene of a mass casualty incident? A, 24-year-old man who's unconscious, has snoring respirations and severe burns. It's the correct answer. B, a 32-year-old woman who is pulseless and apneic and has an abdominal evisceration. She has minimal possibility of survival and she has no vital signs. Now they may be there, but so faint you can't detect them, and she may rouse later. We talked about that possibility a little bit earlier. But in MCI, she's going to be tagged black, or black tagged, and you're going to go on to, in this case, the 24-year-old man. C, a 29-year-old woman who's in full cardiac arrest with massive open chest trauma. She has a low possibility of surviving. And a 32-year-old man with an open head injury, exposed brain matter, and no carotid pulse. They have a low possibility of surviving. In fact, this gentleman, unfortunately, is probably already gone. 6, how does a disaster differ from a mass casualty incident? A, disasters may not involve personal injuries. B, in a disaster, EMS may be on the scene for days or weeks. C, only an elected official can declare a disaster. Or D, all of the above. If you remember the definition of disaster versus the definition of a mass casualty incident, this one will be easy. And it is D. Many disasters, such as droughts that cause widespread crop damage, do not involve personal injury. An MCI generally lasts no longer than a few hours, but emergency responders may be on the scene for days or weeks in a disaster. Although you can declare an MCI, only an elected official can declare a disaster. And let's look at the incorrect answer. How does a disaster differ from a mass casualty incident? A, disaster may not involve personal injuries. That is true of a disaster. B, in a disaster, EMS may be on the scene for days or weeks. Also true. C, only an elected official can declare a disaster. That is true as well. So, of course, the correct answer is D, all of the above. Question 7. A large tanker truck is overturned on a highway. When you arrive, you see a clear liquid leaking from the rear of the tanker. The driver, who appears to be unconscious, is still in the vehicle and bleeding heavily from the face. You should A, immediately notify law enforcement for traffic control, B, fully assess the situation and request the appropriate assistance. C, put on gloves, a gown, a mask, and quickly remove the driver. Or D, go to the rear of the tanker and figure out or determine what type of liquid is leaking. This one should be relatively easy as well. It's just logical. And the answer is B. Upon arriving at the scene of a possible HazMat incident, you must first step back and assess the situation. This can be very stressful, especially if you see a patient. However, rushing into such a situation puts your own life in jeopardy. Once you have a properly assessed scene, you should request the appropriate assistance, such as fire department or hazardous material or HazMat team. Let's look at the incorrect answer. In this situation with a large tanker truck and an injured driver who's unconscious and bleeding heavily, you should A, immediately notify law enforcement for traffic control. They're part of the assistance needed at the scene, but rescue, fire, and HazMat providers, of course, need to be notified as well. The police can't possibly do anything except direct traffic to help control the scene at that point. You need specialists. B, fully assess the situation and request appropriate assistance. We determine that is, of course, the correct answer. C, put on gloves, again, a mask, and quickly remove the driver. That's definitely what you should not do. It's a potentially hazardous environment, and access should not be attempted until the scene has been deemed safe. D, go to the rear of the tanker and determine what type of fluid is leaking. Unless you're trained as a HazMat technician, which is another level of training. I talked about hazardous materials awareness level training that you need. Technician is way on up. And so unless you're trained as a HazMat technician and you have the proper gear handy, which you won't in an ambulance, and you're part of the entry team, you're not going to enter this type of hazard zone. Question 8. Which of the following situations most likely involves a hazardous material? A, a milk truck that's overturning leaking fluid. B, a tractor-trailer rig that is emitting a visible cloud. C, a moving van that collided head-on with a small car. Or D, a pickup truck from the gas company that struck a tree. This one, using logic, should be relatively simple. It's B. A crash does not need to occur for a spill or leak to happen. A vehicle that is emitting a visible cloud should make you suspicious that a hazardous material is involved, especially if the vehicle is a tractor-trailer rig. In such cases, you should stay uphill and upwind and notify the fire department and or HazMat team. The incorrect answers. Which of the following situations most likely involves a hazardous material? A, a milk truck that is overturned and leaking fluid. It's not a possibility. It is a possibility, but it's not the most likely possibility. And there's one thing to consider too. If it's a milk truck that's overturned, it might be leaking fuel as well. However, diesel fuel, it will burn, but it will not ignite with a spark versus gasoline. Gasoline gives off vapors. One spark, the gas ignites. Unless that spark is right in the fuel with diesel fuel, it won't ignite with an explosion. It will burn, but a spark won't set it off like it will gasoline. So in this situation, most likely you're not going to need a hazardous materials team. B, tractor-trailer rig that's emitting a visible cloud. That, of course, is the correct answer. C, a moving van that collided head-on with a small car. Again, it's a possibility, but not most likely possibility. And D, a pickup truck from the gas company that struck a tree. Again, that's also a possibility, but not super likely. Number 9, when dealing with a hazardous materials incident, where should you set up your decontamination zone? Think about the different zones. A, inside the hazard zone. B, inside the treatment area. C, between the hazard zone and treatment area. And D, between the treatment and transportation zone. This one, again, if you think about what we covered and the different zones, you should get this one with relative ease. C, the decontamination area should be set up between the hazard zone and the treatment area. This way, patients cannot bring any hazardous materials into the treatment area and contaminate anyone else. Let's talk about the incorrect answers. When dealing with a HazMat incident, where should you set up your decontamination area? A, inside the hot zone. It needs to be on the edge of the hazard zone or slightly beyond, not inside of it. That makes no sense. B, inside the treatment area. Definitely not, because you don't want contaminated patients in the treatment area. C, between the hazard zone and the treatment area. That's the correct answer. Or D, between the treatment and transportation zone. Again, that's not correct, because patients need to be decontaminated prior to entering the treatment and transport area. Question 10. Which toxicity level would you assign a hazardous material spill that would cause a person temporary damage or residual injury unless prompt medical treatment is given? We talked about level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. So if you think back to those levels that we went over and look at this question, I know you'll get the correct answer. It is B. Level 2 toxicity includes materials that could cause temporary damage or residual injury unless prompt medical treatment is provided. Level 1 toxicity includes materials that would cause little, if any, health hazard. Level 3 toxicity includes materials that are extremely hazardous to health and require full protective gear. And level 4 toxicity includes materials that are so hazardous that even minimal contact will cause death. Remember I said the higher the number, the greater the hazard here. So that's the easiest way for you to remember that. Let's look at the incorrect answers. And we really just went over these, but level 1, just to review, is materials that cause few health hazards. Level 2, in this case, is a HazMat material that would cause a person temporary damage or residual injury unless they receive prompt medical treatment. That's level 2. And for this question, that's the correct answer. Level 3 are materials that are extremely hazardous, and they have the potential to cause permanent damage and residual injury. And level 4, of course, can cause death, even with minimal contact. So that's everything for this chapter. That's chapter 39. So please take the time to review the tables that we went over. Make sure that you review all of the resources available to you to identify and help assess a potential HazMat incident. Make sure you review incident command system and know when and how you fit into that type of situation. Review mass casualty incidents and disasters and the differences between the two. Thank you for all of your attention, and we'll see you next class.